Have you ever smiled through years of rejection, knowing that the people who should have believed in you were the ones who doubted you the most? I did. For nearly 15 years, my family introduced me as the daughter who never lived up to her potential, while praising my younger cousin Ethan as the one who would carry our family's legacy. Every birthday, every holiday, every gathering ended the same way, with someone comparing my life to his. They thought they knew my story. They thought my silence meant failure. But they never asked what I had been sacrificing, or who I had quietly become. The truth stayed buried until one ordinary weekend forced every lie into the open. And by then, there was no way anyone could put it back. My name is Victoria Hayes. I'm 36 years old, and I work as a forensic financial investigator for one of the country's largest compliance firms. My job has never been glamorous. Most people picture exciting courtrooms or dramatic police raids, but the reality is thousands of hours spent following paper trails that other people ignore. I love that kind of work, because facts never cared about popularity. Numbers couldn't be manipulated by family favoritism, and evidence never chose sides. That's probably why I preferred my office over family dinners. Growing up, my grandmother believed I could accomplish anything. She used to tell me, "Truth is patient. It never rushes because it always catches up." After she passed away, everything changed. My Uncle Richard slowly became the voice everyone listened to, and somehow Ethan always stood exactly where the spotlight landed. He was charismatic, confident, and incredibly skilled at making people believe whatever version of events benefited him. If I earned a promotion, it was because I was lucky. If Ethan landed a new client, it was because he was brilliant. Over time, people stopped questioning those narratives. When my father died unexpectedly, I quietly stepped in to handle every legal document, every unpaid bill, and every financial obligation he left behind. Nobody noticed. At the funeral, relatives praised Ethan for giving a heartfelt speech, while I spent hours making sure my mother wouldn't lose the house. That was the pattern of my life. Someone else received the applause while I carried the responsibility. Then one Thursday afternoon, everything shifted. As I was reviewing audit files in my office, my phone vibrated. The caller ID showed my Aunt Linda. We rarely spoke unless there was a family emergency. "Victoria," she said nervously, "your grandfather wants the entire family together this Saturday. He says it's important." Nobody knows why, but he sounded serious. I stared out the office window. My grandfather never called meetings. Not unless something had gone terribly wrong. I had no idea that accepting that invitation would uncover a secret hidden for more than 20 years. And before that weekend was over, my own family would discover that the quiet woman they ignored had been holding the one truth capable of changing every one of their lives. Saturday arrived colder than expected. The drive to my grandfather's farmhouse took almost 2 hours, giving me far too much time to wonder why he had suddenly called everyone together. During the last decade, he had avoided large family gatherings unless Christmas absolutely required it. Now, without explanation, every child, grandchild, aunt, uncle, and cousin had been asked to attend. Whatever this was, it mattered. The gravel driveway was already full when I arrived. Expensive SUVs and luxury sedans lined both sides of the property. Through the front windows, I could already hear laughter. It sounded like every other family gathering, and somehow that made me even more uneasy. The moment I stepped inside, Aunt Melissa smiled politely before asking the same question everyone always asked. "Still working those accounting jobs?" Before I could answer, Ethan casually joined the conversation. "Victoria likes paperwork more than people," he joked, making several relatives laugh. "She's probably the only person who gets excited about tax documents." I forced a small smile. Correcting people had never changed anything. Nobody in the room knew I hadn't worked in accounting for years. Nobody knew companies hired me when millions of dollars disappeared. Executives committed fraud, or families fought over stolen estates. Confidentiality agreements prevented me from discussing my cases anyway, so letting them underestimate me had become easier than explaining the truth. As lunch was being prepared, I noticed something unusual. My grandfather wasn't greeting guests. Instead, he remained alone in his study with the door slightly open. Every few minutes his attorney walked in carrying another folder. My grandfather would sign something, place it into a large wooden box beside his desk, and quietly move on to the next document. Whatever they were preparing involved far more than an ordinary family announcement. Around 3 o'clock, everyone gathered in the living room. My grandfather slowly walked in using his cane, and looked at each of us for a long moment before speaking. "I've spent the last 6 months organizing my affairs," he said calmly. "At my age, tomorrow is never guaranteed." The room became silent. "I don't want my family fighting after I'm gone. I've seen too many families destroyed because truth arrived too late." Several people exchanged nervous glances. Then he looked directly at Ethan. "I've trusted certain people more than others. Today, I need to know whether that trust was deserved." For the first time all afternoon, Ethan's confident smile faded ever so slightly. My grandfather nodded toward his attorney. The attorney placed a thick leather binder on the coffee table. "I've asked for an independent financial review of every family trust, investment account, and property transaction connected to this estate over the past 12 years. A chill ran through the room. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved. Then my grandfather said something that made every pair of eyes turn toward me. "Victoria, I specifically requested that you stay after everyone leaves." The room instantly filled with confused expressions. Ethan looked at me, then back at my grandfather. "Why her?" he asked with a nervous laugh. My grandfather didn't answer. He simply rested one hand on the leather binder and quietly said, "Because before I make the biggest decision of my life, there's one question only Victoria can answer." At that moment, I realized this family gathering had never been about an inheritance. It was about discovering who had been lying to our family for years, and someone in that room was already terrified that I knew the truth. The room remained silent after my grandfather's words. Nobody reached for a drink. Nobody looked at the binder. Every person in the house was looking at me instead. I could almost hear the questions forming in their minds. Why Victoria? Why not Ethan? Why would Grandpa trust the quiet granddaughter who always stayed in the background? I wished I had an answer myself. Ethan broke the silence with a laugh that sounded just a little too forced. "Grandpa, if this is about paperwork, Victoria has always been good at that stuff. But if we're making family decisions, shouldn't everyone be involved?" Several relatives nodded in agreement. They had spent years believing Ethan was the responsible one, the natural leader of the family. Watching their reactions, I realized how deeply that image had taken root. My grandfather calmly adjusted his glasses before replying. "Everyone will be involved when the time is right. But first I need facts, not opinions." The sentence landed like a stone in still water. For a brief moment, Ethan's smile disappeared. Then it returned. "I don't understand what facts you're talking about." "You will," my grandfather answered quietly. The attorney opened the leather binder and carefully removed several sealed envelopes. Every envelope carried the logo of a different bank, investment firm, or law office. None of them had been opened. My grandfather looked at me again. "Victoria, your aunt told me you've spent the last several years investigating financial misconduct." I hesitated. "My work is confidential." "I know. So why ask me here?" "Because I don't need confidential information." He gently tapped the stack of envelopes. "I need someone whose judgment hasn't been influenced by this family." The room became uncomfortable. Aunt Melissa crossed her arms. Uncle Richard looked annoyed. Even my mother shifted nervously in her chair. For years, everyone had assumed I wasn't important enough to be included in major family decisions. Now the very person they respected most was placing his trust in me instead. My grandfather continued. 3 months ago, I noticed money disappearing from accounts I rarely checked. The amounts were small at first. Then properties were refinanced. Investments were moved. Documents appeared with signatures I don't remember making. The air suddenly felt heavier. I hired an outside law firm. He nodded toward the attorney. They completed an independent review. Nobody said a word. Ethan leaned forward. "So, what did they find?" The attorney didn't answer him. Instead, he looked directly at me. "Ms. Hayes, your grandfather has one request. Before these reports are presented to the family, he'd like an independent professional to verify every conclusion. Given your career, you're uniquely qualified." I stared at the folders. Accepting meant stepping into the middle of a family conflict that could destroy relationships forever. Refusing meant walking away from someone who trusted me when almost nobody else ever had. I'll review them, I finally said. Across the room, Ethan's jaw tightened for only a second before he forced another smile. Perfect, he said. I'm sure everything will check out. Maybe he believed that. Maybe he was hoping everyone else would. But years of investigating fraud had taught me one simple lesson. People become nervous long before the evidence speaks. And as the attorney slid the first folder across the table toward me, I noticed something almost everyone else missed. Ethan wasn't watching me. He was watching the binder, as if he already knew exactly what was inside it. And the moment I opened the first file, one familiar signature made my heart stop, because it belonged to someone my grandfather trusted completely. Yet I knew with absolute certainty it couldn't be genuine. I didn't say a word as I stared at the signature. At first glance, it looked authentic. The handwriting matched my grandfather's almost perfectly. The spacing, the slant, even the pressure marks were convincing enough to fool most people. But forensic investigations had trained my eyes to notice details others overlooked. Something about the signature felt rehearsed. It wasn't written naturally. It had been copied. I looked up at my grandfather. When did you sign this? He adjusted his glasses before taking the document from my hands. I don't remember signing it. The room instantly became tense. Ethan leaned forward. Grandpa, you're 83. Maybe you just forgot. Several relatives quietly agreed. Age was the easiest explanation. But experience had taught me that convenient explanations often protected inconvenient truths. I lowered the document onto the table. Memory loss doesn't create identical signatures. Everyone looked at me. What do you mean? Aunt Melissa asked. I pointed toward 3 different pages inside the binder. These signatures were supposedly signed over a period of 11 months. So, they're identical. Nobody understood. I continued. When people naturally sign their name, every signature is slightly different. Tiny changes happen every single time. The angle changes. The pressure changes. Small details shift without us realizing it. I placed the pages side by side. These don't. The room fell silent. They're exact copies. Even the attorney leaned closer. My grandfather slowly removed his glasses. So you're saying? I'm saying someone didn't imitate your signature. I paused. They duplicated it. No one spoke. Across the room, Ethan quietly uncrossed his arms. It was such a small movement that almost nobody noticed. I did. Because nervous people often reveal themselves through their bodies long before their words. Trying not to draw attention to himself, Ethan walked toward the kitchen. I'll grab everyone some coffee. He barely reached the doorway before my grandfather stopped him. Ethan. He turned. Sit down. The firmness in his voice surprised everyone. Ethan smiled awkwardly before returning to his chair. The attorney opened another folder. There are 17 transactions carrying this same signature. 17? My mother whispered. The attorney nodded. Properties, investment transfers, trust distributions, and refinancing agreements. Uncle Richard suddenly cleared his throat. Surely the banks verified everything. They verified the signatures, I replied, not the person placing them on the documents. Nobody argued, because everyone understood how easily paperwork could become truth once enough institutions accepted it. I continued reviewing the files. Every page told the same story. Small withdrawals, minor transfers, amounts too insignificant to trigger immediate concern, until they accumulated into hundreds of thousands of dollars. Whoever designed this hadn't stolen quickly. They had stolen patiently. That was the dangerous kind. Patient people rarely made careless mistakes. Then I reached the final document inside the first folder. Unlike the others, this one wasn't a bank record. It was an insurance policy. The beneficiary section had been changed only 6 weeks earlier. Someone had quietly removed 2 family members. Someone else had been added. My grandfather leaned closer. Whose name is on it? I looked down. For several long seconds, I couldn't answer. because the name staring back at me wasn't the one I expected. It wasn't Ethan. It wasn't Uncle Richard. It wasn't anyone sitting in that living room. It belonged to a person every member of our family believed had disappeared from our lives more than 15 years ago. I slowly closed the file. Then I looked directly at my grandfather. I think this investigation is much bigger than missing money. The attorney frowned. What makes you say that? I slid the insurance policy across the table. Because whoever planned this wasn't preparing to steal your estate. They were preparing for the day you were gone. And the first clue leads to someone our entire family thought we'd never see again. No one in the room spoke. My grandfather slowly picked up the insurance policy with trembling hands and stared at the beneficiary page, as though he were reading someone else's life. That's impossible, he whispered. She hasn't been part of this family in over 15 years. The attorney quietly adjusted his glasses before responding. According to the insurance company, the beneficiary change was legally filed 6 weeks ago. Every document appears valid. The words hung in the air like a storm cloud. Ethan looked genuinely confused now, while Uncle Richard suddenly became unusually interested in the fireplace instead of the paperwork. I watched everyone's reactions carefully. In my profession, people rarely revealed themselves through what they said. They revealed themselves through what they avoided. My grandfather handed the document back to me. Victoria, find out who submitted this. I nodded but didn't answer immediately. Instead, I examined the filing details printed at the bottom of the page. Every insurance modification leaves a trail. Date. Time. Processing office. Verification method. Most people ignored those details. I never did. One line immediately caught my attention. The beneficiary request hadn't been submitted online. It had been processed in person at a local branch less than 20 miles from my grandfather's house. Did you visit this office recently? I asked. He looked surprised. I haven't been there in years. Then whoever filed this knew exactly which branch handled your policies. The attorney leaned closer. Can we request surveillance footage? I slowly shook my head. Most branches only retain footage for 30 days. He checked the date. The request was made 43 days ago. The room grew quieter. Someone had planned this carefully. Every deadline had already passed. Every piece of evidence seemed just far enough out of reach. That wasn't luck. That was preparation. As everyone debated possible explanations, I quietly reviewed another folder from the binder. This one contained property tax records dating back nearly a decade. At first everything looked routine, until I noticed the mailing address listed beside one of my grandfather's rental properties. It wasn't his home address. It wasn't his attorney's office. It wasn't any address connected to our family. It was a private post office mailbox rented under a limited liability company. I immediately circled it with my pen. Has anyone ever heard of Ashford Property Services? I asked. Blank faces filled the room. Even my grandfather shook his head. I've never owned a company by that name. The attorney frowned. Neither have I. I pulled out my laptop and entered the company name into a public corporate registry. Within seconds, a registration appeared. Active. Registered 8 years earlier. Minimal public information. Then I opened the filing history. My heartbeat slowed. Not because I was nervous. Because I recognized the pattern. Shell companies leave fingerprints just like forged signatures do. Small filing fees. Minimal activity. Hidden ownership. Used only when someone wants assets to quietly disappear. I clicked the registered agent information. The screen loaded. Then stopped. I read the name once. Then again. Across the room, Ethan noticed my expression. What is it? He asked. I turned the laptop toward my grandfather without saying a word. His eyes widened. The color drained from his face. No. He whispered. That can't be right. Everyone leaned forward. Because the registered agent managing the company connected to our family's missing assets was someone who had been sitting in the same living room with us for the last 3 hours, pretending to be just as shocked as everyone else. Every head in the room turned toward the laptop. Nobody spoke. Nobody even seemed to breathe. My grandfather slowly reached for his reading glasses before staring at the screen again. hoping the name would somehow change. It didn't. The registered agent for Ashford Property Services was someone every member of our family had trusted for years. Our longtime financial advisor, Harold Benson. He had managed my grandfather's investments for nearly 2 decades, attended countless family dinners, and was treated almost like a member of the family himself. The silence was finally broken by Aunt Melissa. "That has to be some kind of mistake," she whispered. "Harold would never do something like this." I didn't answer immediately. Experience had taught me that fraud rarely begins with strangers. More often than not, it begins with someone who already has access, credibility, and everyone's complete trust. My grandfather slowly lowered himself into his chair. "I've signed hundreds of documents with Harold over the years." His voice carried more disappointment than anger. "He handled everything after your grandmother passed away." I nodded while continuing to review the company's filings. The deeper I looked, the more unusual the pattern became. Ashford Property Services had never reported meaningful business activity, never hired employees, and never advertised its services. Yet somehow, over the last 8 years, several properties connected to my grandfather's estate had quietly listed the company as their mailing contact. That wasn't normal. Legitimate businesses leave visible footprints. This company seemed to exist only on paper, exactly the kind of structure someone would create to redirect money without attracting attention. The attorney leaned closer. "Can you determine who actually owns the company?" I clicked through another filing, but the ownership information had been hidden behind a corporate trust. Whoever built this structure knew exactly how to make it difficult to trace. "Not from public records," I replied. "But hidden ownership doesn't mean invisible ownership. Every transaction leaves another trail somewhere." Ethan folded his arms and finally spoke. "So we're accusing Harold now? Isn't this all a little premature?" His tone sounded reasonable, but something about the timing bothered me. Until now, Ethan had been unusually quiet. Suddenly, he seemed eager to steer everyone's attention toward uncertainty instead of evidence. I looked at him calmly. "I'm not accusing anyone." Then I tapped the laptop screen. "The documents are." The room became silent again. My grandfather slowly rubbed his forehead. "Call Harold," he said to the attorney. "Ask him to come here." The attorney immediately reached for his phone and dialed the number. Everyone listened as the call rang once, twice, 3 times. Finally, it went to voicemail. He tried again. The same result. Then he sent a text message marked urgent. Still nothing. My grandfather frowned. "That's strange. Harold always answers my calls." I checked the filing dates again, and another detail immediately caught my eye. Every major transaction had happened on a Friday afternoon, only minutes before banks closed for the weekend. Whoever organized this operation understood that delays created distance, and distance made fraud harder to detect. Just then my own phone vibrated. It was an email notification from a colleague at my firm. Earlier that afternoon, before leaving for the gathering, I had quietly asked him to perform a routine corporate search on Ashford Property Services. I opened the attachment. It contained only one sentence, but it was enough to make my stomach tighten. "Victoria, Ashford Property Services was officially dissolved yesterday morning, exactly 12 hours before your grandfather called the family meeting." I slowly looked up from the screen and met my grandfather's eyes. Someone hadn't just hidden the truth for years. They had realized this meeting was coming, and sometime within the last 24 hours, they had begun destroying the evidence before any of us even walked into this house. Nobody moved for several seconds. The email had changed everything. This was no longer just an old family dispute buried in paperwork. Whoever had created Ashford Property Services had learned about my grandfather's meeting before anyone else, and had dissolved the company only hours earlier. That wasn't coincidence. It meant someone with inside knowledge had been watching every move my grandfather made. I slowly locked my phone and looked around the room. Some relatives looked frightened. Others looked confused. But one person immediately caught my attention. Ethan wasn't surprised. He wasn't asking questions like everyone else. Instead, he seemed unusually focused on reading everyone else's reactions, almost as if he were trying to calculate what they knew. Years of interviewing suspects had taught me one important lesson. Innocent people search for answers. Guilty people search for information. My grandfather broke the silence. How could anyone know about this meeting? Nobody answered. Only 4 people had known about today's gathering before the invitations were sent. My grandfather, his attorney, Aunt Linda, and the family assistant who managed his calendar. Yet someone had acted less than 24 hours before we arrived. That meant information had leaked from somewhere inside his trusted circle. The attorney immediately pulled out his notebook and reviewed the timeline. The invitations were made by phone, he said. Nothing was sent by email. No public notices. No letters. My grandfather slowly nodded. Then whoever knew, heard it directly from someone I trusted. As everyone tried to make sense of the situation, I quietly opened another document from the binder. Most people were still discussing the dissolved company, but my attention shifted to something much smaller, a maintenance invoice attached to one of the property files. At first glance it looked ordinary. Lawn care, roof inspection, electrical repairs. Then one line stopped me. Every payment had been approved by someone identified only with the initials RH. I checked another invoice. The same initials appeared. Then another. Again. RH, whoever RH was, they had approved thousands of dollars in payments over several years without ever signing a full name. I turned toward my grandfather. Who is RH? He looked at the invoices for a moment before answering. No one in this family has those initials. Uncle Richard immediately shook his head. Aunt Melissa looked equally confused. Even the attorney frowned. I've never noticed that before, he admitted. I continued flipping through the files until I reached the oldest invoice. 8 years earlier. Same initials. Same handwriting. Same approval code. This wasn't random. Someone had deliberately hidden behind 2 simple letters, while quietly authorizing payments that no one questioned. Just then the attorney's phone rang. Everyone looked toward him. The caller ID displayed Harold Benson's office. He answered immediately and switched to speaker. A receptionist's nervous voice filled the room. Mr. Benson won't be available. He resigned this morning and cleared out his office before noon. We were told all client files had already been transferred. The attorney frowned. Transferred where? There was a brief pause. We don't know. He left without giving anyone a forwarding address. The call ended. The room fell completely silent again. My grandfather slowly closed his eyes. 20 years of trust had vanished in less than 30 seconds. But something about Harold's disappearance didn't feel complete. Professionals who commit financial fraud usually prepare an escape long before anyone notices. Harold had disappeared too quickly, almost as if someone else had warned him exactly when to leave. Then my phone vibrated once more. It was another message from my colleague. Only 5 words. Don't trust the attorney either. My heartbeat slowed. I looked across the room at the man sitting beside my grandfather. The same man who had been helping organize every document since this investigation began. And in that moment, I realized the person helping us uncover the truth might actually be the one making sure we never found all of it. The message stayed on my screen for several seconds. Don't trust the attorney either. I read it 3 times before locking my phone. My first instinct was to confront him immediately, but instinct is dangerous when evidence is still incomplete. Throughout my career, I had seen too many investigations collapse because someone acted before they understood the entire picture. If the attorney was involved, accusing him without proof would only give him time to destroy whatever evidence remained. I slipped my phone back into my pocket and forced myself to remain calm. Across the room, he continued organizing documents as though nothing had happened. His movements were steady. His expression never changed. If he was hiding something, he had spent years learning how to hide it well. My grandfather noticed my silence. "Victoria, what is it?" he asked. Every pair of eyes turned toward me again. I shook my head gently. "Nothing I can confirm yet." That answer wasn't completely true, but it was the only responsible one. My colleague had never been wrong before, yet a warning wasn't evidence. It was only a reason to start asking better questions. The attorney quietly closed another folder and looked toward me. "Do you see something concerning?" His voice sounded perfectly normal. But one small detail caught my attention. Since the meeting began, he had repeatedly referred to certain financial files without reading their labels first. He always seemed to know exactly which document was where. Most attorneys stay organized. Very few memorize 8 years of paperwork unless they've spent far more time with it than they should have. Trying not to reveal what I was thinking, I asked a simple question. When did you first notice irregularities in these accounts? The attorney answered almost instantly. About 6 months ago. I nodded. Interesting. He looked confused. Why? I slid one of the bank statements across the table. Because this report shows someone requested certified copies of these same records 14 months ago. His expression froze for less than a second. It was barely noticeable, but I saw it. Then he smiled. I must have misspoken. Maybe he had. Maybe he hadn't. Either way, the timeline no longer matched. While everyone focused on the discussion, I quietly examined the leather binder itself instead of the papers inside it. Something felt unusual. The binder was much heavier than it should have been. I turned it over and noticed that the inside back cover was slightly thicker than the front. Running my fingers along the stitching, I felt a narrow ridge hidden beneath the leather. Without saying a word, I carefully pressed against it. A soft click echoed through the silent room. The back panel lifted open just enough to reveal a concealed compartment. Everyone leaned forward. Inside wasn't cash. It wasn't jewelry. It wasn't another stack of legal papers. There was only a single black USB drive sealed inside a transparent evidence pouch. Attached to it was a handwritten note in my grandfather's handwriting. If you're reading this, don't trust the documents alone. Trust the recordings. The room fell silent. My grandfather stared at the hidden compartment in complete disbelief. I don't remember putting that there, he whispered. The attorney looked equally surprised. Or at least he appeared to. I carefully removed the evidence pouch without touching the drive itself. Old habits die hard. If someone had prepared this as evidence, fingerprints and digital records might still matter. I handed the pouch to my grandfather. What recordings? Aunt Melissa asked nervously. I looked at the label attached to the drive. It contained only one date. October 14th. 8 years earlier. My heartbeat slowed. Because 8 years earlier was the exact week when the unexplained transfers had first appeared. And if the files on that USB contained what I suspected, someone in this room hadn't just stolen money. They had unknowingly recorded themselves explaining exactly how they planned to do it. No one reached for the USB drive. It sat in my grandfather's trembling hands, as though it carried the weight of every unanswered question our family had ignored for years. The handwritten note echoed in my mind. Don't trust the documents alone. Trust the recordings. My grandfather looked at me. Victoria, whatever is on this drive, I want everyone here to hear it together. I nodded, but before inserting it into my laptop, I made a complete forensic copy onto an external drive. If this contains evidence, I explained. We never examine the original first. Ethan sighed impatiently. Seriously? Isn't that a little excessive? I looked at him calmly. Evidence only matters if you protect it. He leaned back without another word, but I noticed him checking his watch for the third time in less than 10 minutes. It wasn't the behavior of someone eager to learn the truth. It was the behavior of someone waiting for something to happen. Once the copy was complete, I opened the first folder on the drive. There were dozens of audio recordings organized by date. Some lasted only a few minutes. Others stretched beyond an hour. The earliest file matched the date written on the label, October 14th, 8 years earlier. I pressed play. At first, there was only the sound of chairs moving across a hardwood floor and coffee being poured into cups. Then my grandfather's voice filled the room. Let's keep this simple. I want every investment documented, every expense approved, and every decision put in writing. A second voice answered almost immediately. It belonged to Harold Benson. Of course. Transparency protects everyone. The room remained silent as we listened. For nearly 20 minutes, the conversation sounded completely ordinary. Budgets, maintenance costs, taxes, and retirement planning. Nothing suspicious. Ethan folded his arms with a faint smile, as if relieved that the recording proved nothing. Then, just before the file ended, another voice entered the room. It wasn't loud. It wasn't even clear at first. Someone had walked in after the meeting had supposedly finished. I increased the volume and replayed the final 30 seconds. Harold's voice returned, softer this time. Don't worry. He signs whatever I place in front of him now. Another person laughed quietly before replying. Just make sure nobody outside the family starts asking questions. The recording ended abruptly. Every person in the living room looked at one another. The second voice wasn't clear enough to identify, but one thing was certain. Harold hadn't been acting alone. I opened the next recording. Different date. Different meeting. Again, most of the conversation sounded routine. But every file ended the same way. After my grandfather left the room, someone continued talking with Harold. They discussed paperwork, property taxes, bank appointments, and signatures they needed before the end of the month. None of the recordings directly admitted theft, but together they formed a disturbing pattern. Whatever had been happening wasn't an isolated mistake. It had been carefully planned over several years. My grandfather slowly lowered his head into his hands. All this time, he whispered. They were sitting in my office while I believed they were protecting me. As I prepared to open the final recording, something else caught my attention. Hidden inside the folder was a document named Read Me First. It wasn't there by accident. I opened it. There was only one sentence typed across the page. If these recordings are ever needed, compare the voices to the security system archive stored in the red safe. I frowned. Red safe. My grandfather looked up immediately. There's only one red safe in this house. He stood slowly, pointing toward the old library at the end of the hallway. Your grandmother insisted we never repaint it. Nobody had opened that safe in years. We all turned toward the hallway at the same time. Just then, the lights throughout the house suddenly went out. The room dropped into complete darkness. A second later, we heard the unmistakable sound of a heavy door slamming somewhere inside the house. Someone else was still here. And whoever it was had just realized we were getting dangerously close to the truth. For nearly 5 seconds, nobody moved. The entire house was swallowed by darkness, leaving only the faint glow of emergency lights from the kitchen appliances. Somewhere down the hallway, a wooden door slammed hard enough to shake the walls. My grandfather instinctively reached for the edge of the table to steady himself. Several relatives gasped while Aunt Melissa whispered, "Did the power just fail?" I pulled my phone from my pocket and switched on the flashlight. One by one, everyone else did the same. Thin beams of light cut through the darkness, revealing anxious faces that looked nothing like they had an hour earlier. Whatever confidence had existed when the meeting began had completely disappeared. We weren't discussing suspicious paperwork anymore. Someone had just reacted to the evidence, and that meant they were still close enough to know exactly what we had discovered. I looked toward the hallway where the sound had come from. The old library door stood half open, gently moving back and forth. "Nobody leaves this room alone," I said firmly. Years of investigating corporate fraud had taught me one thing. Panic creates mistakes, and frightened people often destroy the very evidence you're trying to protect. My grandfather nodded in agreement. Victoria's right. We stay together. Even Ethan, who had questioned nearly everything I said that afternoon, remained unusually quiet. His eyes stayed fixed on the hallway. I couldn't tell whether he was afraid of what we might find, or worried about what someone else had already taken. The attorney used his phone to call the local utility company. Within seconds, they confirmed there wasn't a neighborhood outage. Every surrounding property still had electricity. My grandfather slowly looked around the room. Then someone turned our power off manually. Those words settled heavily over the family. The electrical panel was located in the basement, accessible only through a locked service door near the library. Very few people even knew where it was. Whoever had cut the power knew this house extremely well. Keeping everyone together, we walked cautiously toward the hallway. My flashlight illuminated old family portraits hanging along the walls. Faces of relatives from generations past seemed to watch us in complete silence. As we reached the library, I noticed something unusual before anyone else did. The antique rug in front of the red safe had been pushed several inches to one side. My grandfather immediately frowned. That rug never moves. I slowly knelt beside it. Fresh dust marks showed where something heavy had recently been dragged across the wooden floor. Someone had been standing here only minutes earlier. The red safe itself remained locked, but the brass handle was warm to the touch. I looked at my grandfather. Has anyone opened this today? He shook his head without hesitation. Not in years. That answer confirmed my suspicion. Someone had tried. Whether they succeeded or not was another question entirely. My grandfather entered the combination with trembling hands. The locking mechanism clicked open. Slowly he pulled the thick metal door toward him. Inside were several neatly organized document boxes, old family photo albums, and a digital security recorder connected to 4 surveillance cameras that covered different parts of the property. The recorder's screen was still glowing. It hadn't lost power. I carefully checked the system log. At exactly 4:42 p.m., less than 10 minutes before the lights went out, someone had remotely accessed the recorder. Then every archived video from the previous 8 years had been deleted. The room fell completely silent. My grandfather whispered, "They're trying to erase everything." I continued reading the system report. The videos were gone. But one file hadn't been deleted. It had been locked automatically because it was still recording when the deletion command was issued. The timestamp showed it had started only 23 minutes earlier, shortly before our family meeting began. I clicked the file. The screen loaded. A live recording from the hallway outside this very library appeared. Everyone leaned closer. The camera had captured someone entering the hallway before the meeting started. The person's face remained hidden beneath a baseball cap. But as they paused in front of the red safe, they answered an incoming phone call. For just a few seconds, they looked up directly toward the security camera. Their face became perfectly visible. My grandfather's hands began to shake. Aunt Melissa covered her mouth. Even Ethan stepped backward in complete disbelief. Because the person standing in front of the safe wasn't Harold Benson. It was someone every member of our family had trusted for decades. And the moment they spoke their first sentence, we realized this entire investigation had never been about stolen money alone. It had been about a betrayal that began long before any of us knew it existed. For several long seconds, nobody in the room could find the words to speak. The frozen frame on the security monitor seemed impossible to believe. My grandfather slowly reached toward the screen with trembling fingers, almost as if touching it would somehow prove it wasn't real. But the image didn't change. The face staring back at us belonged to Martin Cole, our family's trusted estate consultant for nearly 25 years. He wasn't related to us by blood, yet he had been present for birthdays, anniversaries, business meetings, and nearly every important decision my grandfather had made since my grandmother passed away. We had trusted him so completely that no one ever questioned why he always seemed to know everything before everyone else did. Looking back, that trust suddenly felt less like loyalty, and more like the perfect disguise. I pressed play. Martin looked directly into his phone, and spoke in a calm voice that carried through the silent library. "They're all here now. Once the old man opens those files, everything changes. We need to be gone before they connect the company records." My heartbeat slowed. He wasn't guessing. He already knew exactly what was inside the binder before anyone else in the room had seen it. Then another voice answered through the phone speaker. The recording wasn't perfectly clear, but one sentence came through without distortion. "Did you remove the originals?" Martin nodded confidently. "Most of them. If they find anything now, it'll only tell half the story." The call ended. Martin looked around the hallway, adjusted his jacket, and disappeared out of camera view only minutes before the family meeting officially began. Nobody moved. My grandfather lowered himself into the nearest chair and covered his face with both hands. 25 years. He whispered. I trusted him with everything. His voice wasn't filled with anger. It carried something much heavier, regret. The kind that arrives when you realize the person standing beside you during your hardest moments had quietly been building the disaster you never saw coming. Around the room, relatives exchanged stunned glances. The confidence everyone once placed in Martin had vanished in an instant. But something about the recording still bothered me. If Martin believed he had removed the original evidence, why would he leave without checking the hidden USB drive? Experienced fraudsters don't overlook details, unless they didn't know every hiding place. I reopened the folders on the USB drive and searched for anything connected to Martin. Most files contain meeting recordings, financial reports, or handwritten notes. Then I found one folder simply labeled emergency. Unlike every other file, this one required a password. My grandfather frowned. I don't remember creating that. The attorney leaned closer. Can it be opened? I smiled faintly. Every password tells a story. Looking around the library, my eyes stopped on an old framed photograph resting above the fireplace. It showed my grandparents on their wedding day. Beneath the frame was a brass plaque engraved with one date, June 18, 1964. I entered the date. The folder unlocked immediately. Inside were scanned contracts, voice recordings, property maps, and one video file marked Play Last. Before opening the video, I examined the contracts. Every fraudulent transaction we had already discovered was there, connected by signatures, account numbers, and internal correspondence. But buried beneath those files was something none of us expected. A private agreement signed nearly 15 years earlier showed that Martin hadn't started the fraud alone. He had entered into a confidential partnership with someone inside our own family. One signature belonged to Martin. The second signature had been digitally redacted, but the initials remained visible. Eaka. Every eye in the room slowly turned toward Ethan. His face lost all color. He immediately shook his head. No, that's not me. Nobody answered. Because before anyone could speak, the final video file on the USB drive automatically began playing. The screen lit up. And the first person to appear wasn't Martin. It was my late grandmother, sitting alone in this very library years before she died, looking directly into the camera as she quietly said, "If you're watching this, someone I loved has betrayed this family, and I already know who it is." The entire library fell silent as my grandmother's image filled the screen. She looked older than I remembered, but her eyes were calm, steady, and completely certain of what she was about to say. She took a slow breath before speaking. If this recording is being played, it means I was right. I prayed every day that I wasn't. But some truths refused to stay hidden forever. No one moved. Not even Ethan. My grandmother continued. For years, I watched people confuse confidence with honesty. I watched one man earn trust simply because he always had an answer. And I watched another young man follow him because he believed success was more important than integrity. She paused for a moment. Martin Cole didn't begin this alone. Everyone instinctively looked toward Ethan again. But before anyone could speak, my grandmother gently shook her head on the recording. If you're thinking this is about Ethan, you're looking in the wrong direction. The room froze. I felt every pair of eyes shift away from Ethan. My grandmother continued. Ethan made mistakes. He admired the wrong people. He believed things he shouldn't have believed. But he was never the architect of this betrayal. Ethan's eyes filled with tears. For the first time all afternoon, he looked less defensive and more devastated. Then my grandmother looked directly into the camera. The person who truly betrayed this family is someone who spent years convincing everyone that loyalty meant silence. She slowly reached for a folder sitting beside her. I discovered irregular transactions almost 16 years ago. When I confronted Martin, he admitted everything, but he wasn't stealing for himself anymore. He had already involved outside investors who wanted control of our properties. By then, exposing him immediately would have destroyed the family business, so I secretly began documenting every conversation, every signature, and every account. She smiled sadly. I trusted one person to finish what I started. My grandfather whispered, "Victoria." She nodded in the recording as if she could hear him. Yes, Victoria. Tears rolled down my grandfather's face. She doesn't know this, but since she was a little girl, she always asked questions everyone else ignored. She never accepted appearances as truth. She searched for facts instead of popularity. That's why I left everything in a way only she would understand. I couldn't speak. The room around me disappeared. For years I had believed my grandmother simply loved me. I never realized she had believed in me. She continued, "Money can always be earned again. Property can always be rebuilt. But trust, once broken, takes generations to repair." She looked into the camera one final time. So if you're watching this together, don't waste another day arguing over what was stolen. Protect what still remains. Your family. The screen faded to black. No one spoke for nearly a full minute. Finally, Ethan stood up. His voice trembled. "Victoria." He swallowed hard. I believed Martin because he made me feel important. I signed papers without reading them. I introduced him to people. I defended him every time someone questioned him. He lowered his head. I wasn't the mastermind, but I helped him without realizing what he was really doing. The room remained silent. Then my grandfather slowly walked toward him. For a moment everyone expected anger. Instead, he placed one hand on Ethan's shoulder. Being deceived is painful. He paused, but refusing to admit it would have destroyed what's left of this family. Ethan broke down in tears. One by one, other relatives admitted the moments they had ignored warning signs simply because they trusted the wrong person. That afternoon didn't end with shouting. It didn't end with revenge. It ended with honesty. Over the following months, the evidence collected by my grandmother, combined with the financial records we uncovered, was handed over to federal investigators. Martin Cole and several outside associates were charged with financial fraud, forgery, conspiracy, and asset theft. Much of my grandfather's estate was eventually recovered, while the remaining assets were placed into a transparent family trust that required multiple independent approvals for every future decision. As for me, I never became the family's hero. I became something far more valuable. The person everyone finally trusted. Months later, my grandfather invited the family back to the farmhouse for dinner. There were no lawyers, no bainders, no accusations, just family. As we sat together watching the sunset from the old porch, my grandfather smiled and quietly repeated the words my grandmother used to tell me when I was a little girl. "Truth is patient." I smiled back. It always catches up. For the first time in many years, our family believed it. Final lesson. The greatest danger isn't always the enemy standing in front of you. Sometimes it's the person you've trusted for years without ever asking the difficult questions. Trust should never replace accountability, and love should never require blind loyalty. The strongest families aren't the ones that never face betrayal. They're the ones brave enough to face the truth together, learn from it, and rebuild on honesty instead of appearances. If this story touched your heart, remember this. The truth doesn't always arrive quickly, but it always finds its way into the light. Sometimes the people who underestimate you aren't your enemies. They're simply people who never took the time to know who you really are. Never let someone else's opinion define your worth. Stay patient, stay honest, and let your actions tell the story your words never have to. If you enjoyed this original story, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell, so you never miss our next emotional journey. We'd also love to hear from you. What would you have done if you were Victoria? Share your thoughts in the comments below, because your perspective might inspire someone else. Thank you so much for watching, and until next time, take care of yourself, keep believing in the power of truth, and remember, every hidden story eventually finds its voice. Red Heart.